So hello, everybody. Come on. Yay! I love words of greeting like hello, howdy, hola, aloha, bonjour. My favorite from Denmark is hi, hi. Because they're so happy to see you, they need to say it twice. It's a time where you say, hey, I see you, you see me, and it opens a possibility for a meaningful exchange. So indulge me for a moment, and please turn to your neighbor beside you, in front of you, behind you, and take a moment to say hello to someone you don't know. So let me introduce myself. I'm Meg Linton, and I have the good fortune of being the new CEO for the Newport Beach Public Library Foundation. So that hello feeling you just experienced is how I feel when I open a new book, whether I'm turning a page or I'm pushing the button on my e-reader. And it's also how I feel when I walk into our library. The swoosh of the opening doors is always a breath of possibility, and it's just always a joyous feeling when I walk through those doors. So like tonight's program, its potential is already on its way to being spectacular because all of you are here, and we're here together to talk about libraries. As a part of my new role, I get to say some big thank yous to supporters like the City of Newport Beach, the Friends of the Library with their fabulous bookstore, and the Newport Beach Library Foundation, who is the organizer and host of this event. So I need to ask, how many of you are foundation members? Oh, yay, that's exciting. So for those of you who are not, we hope you'll join the family soon, and you can always talk to me after or go online and figure out how much you want to be part of our family. So now I'd like to call forth our Director of Programs, Kunga Wangmo. She's the one who organizes all the logistics for tonight. She's going to assist me in thanking some of individuals who have gone above and beyond their membership to provide sponsors to the Library Live events. So please hold the applause till the end while we give out a little token of our appreciation. There are a couple people who are not here tonight, so I'm just going to read their names. Natasha Palmer, Alan Hunter Jr., and Sammy and Tammy Tang. And then we've got Dr. Weinberg Staple. Dr. Weinberg, thank you for your donation. And Lauren Blackwood, who's right here in front. And then we also would like to acknowledge Nancy Dalfors, who is our Library Live's Fearless Committee Chair and our Foundation Board Member, who's really been heading everything up and making all of these events happen. So Nancy. So please thank all of our donors. So it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our Library Services Director, Tim Heatherton. After completing his studies and earning a BA in English from St. Mary's, a master's in international studies from the Dominican University, and a master's of library science from San Jose State, Tim joined our library in 1998 as a reference librarian. And during his tenure, he did a stint as the Adult Services Coordinator and Library Services Manager. In the short time I've known Tim, I've learned that he takes the word service very seriously. He is all about the needs of our library-going community and how to best fulfill those needs, whether it's in person or online. He oversees all 4 branches of the Newport Beach Library System, the Central, the Balboa and Mariners, and the soon-to-reopen Corona Del Mar branch. He and his team are the reason why you have such a welcoming and vibrant facility to call your own. Tim Heatherton.
Well, thanks very much, Meg, and thanks for everybody for coming out tonight. So we're here to celebrate the journalist and author Susan Orlean and her latest publication, The Library Book. Now, Miss Orlean is a self-proclaimed lover of libraries, and what began as an investigation of a tragic and horrific fire has allowed her to uncover her readers' unquenchable passion for libraries. Now, The Library Book made its debut last fall. It's in its 9th printing, LA Times Book Prize finalist on the Carnegie Medal long list, and it's a New York Times Book of the Year and bestseller about Miss Orlean. Wrote for The New Yorker. She's written for Vogue, Rolling Stone, Esquire, Outside Magazine. The Orchid Thief, her acclaimed book, formed the basis for the Spike Jonze film adaptation, and her article, Life Swell, which was published in Outside Magazine, was the basis of the film Blue Crush. She has also received acclaim for her book, Rin Tin Tin, The Life and the Legend, chronicling the dog actor's adventures, and her collection of essays, The Bullfighter Checks Her Makeup. Susan's going to come up here in a minute, but I wanted to give her the keys of the kingdom. That's our library card, and I want it to become part of her family of libraries. So without further ado, Susan Orlean, thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited, and I promise to return my books on time. I have to tell you that the podium is this high for me, so thank you for being willing to tower over the audience here on my behalf. I felt a little like the Edith Ann character that Lily Tomlin used to do when I was on the floor and I was just peering over the very edge. I'm so honored to be here and really, truly have been looking forward to this for a long time. This has been on my calendar for months and months. So I've been actually strategizing how to drive down here from LA for many, many months, and here I am. It's amazing. So I want to talk to you about the book, how and why I wrote it, and some of the underlying themes of the book that kept me so engaged for these last 6 years that I worked on the book. And I want to begin by reading a short section, and throughout the evening I'm going to read a few short sections to you from the book. And this is from very, very beginning in the first chapter. I grew up in libraries, or at least it feels that way. I was raised in the suburbs of Cleveland, just a few blocks from the brick-faced Bertram Woods branch of the Shaker Heights library system. Throughout my childhood, starting when I was very young, I went there several times a week with my mother. On those visits, my mother and I walked in together. But as soon as we passed through the door, we split up and each headed to our favorite section. The library might have been the first place I was ever given autonomy. Even when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, I was allowed to head off on my own. Then after a while, my mother and I reunited at the checkout counter with our finds. Together we waited as the librarian pulled out the date card and stamped it with the checkout machine. That giant fist thumping the card with a loud chunk, printing a crooked due date underneath a score of previous crooked due dates that belonged to other people, other times. Our visits to the library were never long enough for me. The place was so bountiful. I loved wandering around the bookshelves, scanning the spines until something happened to catch my eye. Those visits were dreamy, frictionless interludes that promised I would leave richer than I arrived. It wasn't like going to a store with my mom, which guaranteed a tug of war between what I wanted and what my mother was willing to buy me. In the library, I could have anything I wanted. After we checked out, I loved being in the car and having all the books we'd gotten stacked up on my lap, pressing me under their solid, warm weight, their mylar covers sticking a bit to my thighs. It was such a thrill leaving a place with things you hadn't paid for. Such a thrill anticipating the new books we would read. On the ride home, my mom and I talked about the order in which we were going to read our books and how long until they had to be returned. a solemn conversation in which we decided how to pace ourselves through this charmed, evanescent period of grace until the books were due. We both thought all of the librarians at the Bertram Woods Branch Library were beautiful. For a few minutes, we would discuss their beauty. My mother then always mentioned that if she could have chosen any profession at all, she would have chosen to be a librarian. And the car would grow silent for a moment as we both considered what an amazing thing that would have been. When I was older, I usually walked to the library myself, lugging back as many books as I could carry. Occasionally, I did go with my mother, and the trip would be as enchanted as it was when I was small. Even when I was in my last year of high school and could drive myself to the library, my mother and I still went together now and then, and the trip unfolded exactly as it did when I was a child, with all the same beats and pauses and comments and reveries, the same perfect pensive rhythm we followed so many times before. When I miss my mother these days, now that she is gone, I like to picture us in the car together, going for one more magnificent trip to Bertram Woods. Thank you. Thank you so much. So let me tell you how I ended up writing this book, because I certainly never imagined that I would be writing a book about the library. And I never, frankly, thought I would be writing another book. When I had finished Rin Tin Tin, I thought, you know what? That's hard work. And I don't think I can do that again. So I decided I wasn't going to write another book. One day I was in the library, and I don't even remember what I was doing, but I had what I consider the journalist itch. And that is, I'll be somewhere, and I will suddenly look around and think, I've been in this place a million times, and I actually know nothing about it. I have no idea how it operates. I have no idea what goes into making it run. And I was looking around the library, and I thought, I literally have no idea how a library functions. And I thought, someone should write a book about that. Not me, but somebody should. I put it out of my mind, because I really didn't want to write another book. So right around that time, my husband and I moved to Los Angeles, and my son was in first grade. And early on, it must have been one of the first things that came up in his first grade classroom is he had an assignment. And his assignment was to talk to someone, do an interview with someone who worked for the city, for the city. And he came to me, told me about the assignment, and I sized him up. I thought, he's a little 5-year-old boy. And I said, how about if you interview a garbage man? And he sized me up and said, how about if I interview a librarian? And I thought, I am such a good mother. And so I said, that's a great idea, and we'll find out where the closest branch library was, because we were brand new to LA. We didn't even know where our library was. We looked it up, and it was the Studio City branch of the library. And we headed over there, and I had a moment as we were heading there of thinking, just making a mental note that the Studio City Library was about the same distance from our house as the Bertram Woods branch had been from my childhood home. And it was just about the same amount of time sitting in the car and heading over there. And we got to the library, and it doesn't look anything like the Bertram Woods branch, but when I walked in with my son, I was absolutely dumbstruck. There was something about the feel of the place, the size of it, the smell of it, the sound of it, that reminded me exactly of the Bertram Woods Branch Library. And even more than that, it reminded me of those trips with my mother. And I hadn't thought about those trips in decades. And I was so overwhelmed with the emotion of remembering those trips that I stood there dumbstruck, just taking it in and remembering how much it had meant to me and how magical those trips had been. I thought to myself, I wonder what it is about libraries that fill me and fill us with so much emotion. I went lots of places with my mother, and I don't walk into the grocery store and have an epiphany and think, oh my God, this is just like going to the grocery store with my mother. It was something about going to the library. And I thought, someone should write a book about that. It's fascinating. And again, I thought, well, I don't want to write a book, but the idea of what libraries mean to us is absolutely fascinating, and a question that I'm really curious about. Why does something that, on one level, you could think of very simply as just a big building filled with books, but we don't feel about it that way? We have some emotion about a library that's far greater and deeper and warmer than that. Soon after that, I was asked to give a talk for the Library Foundation in LA. And I said, of course, I'd be happy to. And I think it was at some country club. And when I was done giving the talk, the head of the Library Foundation came to me and he said, as a thank you, I'd like to give you a tour of the downtown library. I was very excited because I didn't know LA had a downtown. So I said, this fantastic. I'd love to see this mythical place you call downtown. So we made arrangements to meet soon after that luncheon. And I headed downtown, and I had never seen the library. And the minute I saw it, I was enchanted. It's such a whimsical, strange, kind of almost, it's a very imaginative building. It doesn't look anything like what I expected. And it doesn't look anything like the big city libraries that I was used to. It didn't look like the New York Public Library or the Chicago Public Library. It was as if some architect had fallen asleep with a book about King Tut and a book about Art Deco under his pillow, and then woke up in the morning and drew the building. And as you approach the building and you begin reading all of the inscriptions all over the walls, and it enchanted me immediately. I just thought it was an extraordinary looking place, and I was very, very excited. And we walked around, I was being given the tour, and I just was falling more and more in love with this building and hearing all the stories of who had worked there and who had run the library and various patrons over its long history, and I was just delighted. We were in the fiction section, and the man giving me the tour stopped and pulled a book off the shelf, and he held it up. He took a deep whiff off the book, and I stood there a little awkwardly. I thought, I'm new to LA. I don't know. Do I take another book off, or do I take his book and smell it? What do I do? And what is he doing it for? And he said, you can still smell the smoke in some of them. And I said, sort of fumbling, and I said, did you used to let people smoke in the library? And he said, no, from the fire, from the fire. And I said, what fire? He said, the big fire, big fire in 1986 that closed the library for 7 years. And my jaw dropped, and I said, "What? Tell me more." And in the meantime, he had moved on, and I kept saying, "No, wait, what are you talking about? What fire?" And I thought, somebody ought to write a book about that. So I just want to read a brief section from the part of the book about the fire itself. At first, the smoke in the fiction stacks was as pale as onion skin. Then it deepened to dove gray. Then it turned black. It wound around fiction A through L, curling in lazy ringlets. It gathered into soft puffs that bobbed and banked against the shelves like bumper cars. Suddenly, sharp fingers of flame shot through the smoke and jabbed upward. More flames erupted. The heat built. The temperature reached 451 degrees, and the books began smoldering. Their covers burst like popcorn. Pages flared and blackened and then sprang away from their bindings, a ream of sooty scraps soaring on the updraft. The fire flashed through fiction, consuming as it traveled. It reached for the cookbooks. The cookbooks roasted. The fire scrambled to the 6th tier and then to the 7th. Every book in its path bloomed with flame. When the fire was finally put out, it was understood to be the largest library fire in American history. It burned for 7.5 hours, reaching temperatures of 2,500 degrees. It burned so fiercely that firefighters could only stay in the building for 10 minutes at a time. They were breathing so heavily from the heat. There was a point where the fire department warned the head of the library that they didn't think they could put the fire out because for many reasons it was a perfect storm. It was an enormous amount of fuel and fire that was burning so hot in the stacks, which were like chimneys. The fire was finally put out, and when they did an accounting of what had taken place, they discovered that 400,000 books were destroyed and 700,000 were damaged. Very soon after the fire was put out, it was determined to be arson. So the minute I learned about the fire, I became drawn into this story. For one reason, and a very simple reason to begin with, was the puzzle of why I had never heard about this fire. Now, I was living in New York at the time. It wasn't as if I was living in LA. But I couldn't understand how a fire of that proportion in the second largest city in the country, burning such a massive quantity of books, wouldn't have gotten covered. It just mystified me. So the first thing I did when I got home was to look up the New York Times from that day, and this was in April of 1986. I thought, what was in the paper that day rather than the news of this fire? I called up the New York Times for April 29th, 1986, and the headline was, "Soviets Deny Meltdown at Chernobyl Nuclear Plant." And I thought, that's why. That's why I hadn't heard about the fire. And it was very hard to remember what it was like during Chernobyl until I was flipping through the pages of the New York Times and remembering that we had no idea how serious that was going to be and whether, frankly, whether it was going to be the end of the world. So the fire, as catastrophic as it was, got pushed to the back of the news because of this far greater fire. And it made me understand how it had gotten sort of lost in history because of that. So I became fascinated by the multiple threads, and really it reflected the multiple paths that led me to doing the book. First of all, those deep memories and that feeling that libraries have some evocative power that I really wanted to understand. Secondly, I wanted to understand what had happened in the fire. Who did it if it was an arson? What happened? How did the library survive? And thirdly, I wanted to understand that first question, which was, how do libraries function? I wanted to see how the sausage was made. How do they work day to day? And particularly, how are libraries functioning in an era where it had been predicted for years that libraries were no longer relevant and that basically they were going the way of the buggy whip? And then all of these other stories began emerging because very quickly I discovered that libraries have been burned since libraries have been built. They have been burned by accident, they've been burned in war, and they've been burned on purpose. Arson, unfortunately, has been a part of the history of libraries practically since the first library was established. I was trying to understand, first of all, and most deeply, this question of these memories that were so important to me, and why that memory of going to the library with my mother was so resonant and meant so much. And I had gone to my mother right after I got the book contract, and I told her that I was doing a book about libraries, and like any good mother, she took credit for it and said, you know, I think I'm the one who introduced you to libraries. And I said, you're right, it's doing the book for you. And in many ways, it turned out that I was. I came across an expression as I began working on the book that really stuck with me. And initially, I didn't quite understand why it existed. It was a bit of an odd expression, and it came over time to explain to me the whole point of the book. And this is an expression from Senegal. And in Senegal, if someone dies, you say his or her library has burned. I didn't understand at first how you could equate a person with a library. Coincidentally, soon after I began working on the book, my mother was diagnosed with dementia. And I began observing her memory disappearing a little bit every time I saw her. And I thought about it and tried to make sense of it. And I began to realize that the human memory is organized like a library. Every story we have, all the knowledge we have, the narratives that define who we are, the memories, the vignettes that we keep in our head, we store almost as if they're individual volumes stored in our mind. Similarly, libraries serve almost as our communal mind, where these volumes and volumes of information and knowledge and fantasy and all the stories of our civilization and our culture are stored in a library, really exactly as they're stored in the human mind. And as my mother began losing her memory, I realized that it was as if her library was burning. And that expression suddenly made so much sense to me. And it also made me understand why the burning of a library hits us so deeply. I mean, nobody feels good about any civic building burning, but there's an emotion associated with a library burning that feels painful and horrible in the way that if City Hall burned, you would think, that's a shame, we'll have to rebuild it. But when a library burns, it feels like a true loss. It's why libraries have been burned throughout history. And it was something that came to me as I began, actually idly one day, I Googled burned libraries, just because that's what you do when you're working on a book like this. And up popped a Wikipedia page, burned libraries. And I thought, God, Wikipedia is amazing. But what was more amazing is that it led me to these UNESCO reports that were a compilation of all of the libraries that have been burned in the time period starting around World War I to the present time. And these were this thick, 2 different reports. You know, during World War II, the Nazis had a squad called the Bren Commandos, and their only task was to find and burn libraries. And when I first heard that, I thought, why would you expend the manpower to burn libraries? It's not strategically valuable. I mean, there aren't weapons there. It's not a useful strategy in taking over a city. And then I realized that actually it was a brilliant strategy because it horrifies people and it terrorizes people because we think of libraries as ultimate safe places. And we think of them as the place where all of our shared knowledge is stored. And to burn a library down, particularly when it's a library related to a distinct subculture, is a way of saying, you don't exist. You're being wiped off the Earth's memory. It's also the case, and I haven't done this scientifically, but I would vouch for this as an unscientific fact, an anecdotal fact, that every culture that burns libraries ultimately burns people. And again, it made me realize how deeply connected we are to books and to libraries. They mean more than simply being a repository of printed material. They mean who we are. They mean what we know, and that's our connection. Of course, one of the stories that I was following was the investigation of this arson, because you hear that an individual set a library on fire, burning 400,000 books, damaging 700,000 books, and certainly for me, the first question was, why? Why would someone do that? There was one main suspect in the case, a young man, a wannabe actor named Harry Peake. And he was, among other reasons, a prime suspect because he told a lot of his friends that he had set the fire. Now, Harry Peake had one distinct personality trait. He was a pathological liar. And the problem with the pathological liar is that when they confess to a crime, you don't know, is he still lying, or is he actually this time telling the truth that he committed this crime? And I won't give too much away, but the investigation was quite convoluted, to say the least. And Harry, and how he came to a point in his life where he was confessing and sort of bragging to friends that he had started this fire, became absolutely fascinating to me. He was somebody who, though was very much a character that the library would have embraced because he was first and foremost a storyteller. Most of the stories were not true. Small problem. But I kept coming back over and over again to the idea that I truly believe in, and that is that stories are the single most essential unit of the human experience. The stories we tell each other, the stories we tell ourselves. And libraries exist to preserve those stories. And our connection to them, again, is so deep and so emotional. It's not just a place filled with books. Now, there was an incredible calamity when this fire took place. Among other things, the LA Library had insurance, I should say the city had insurance, of course. The insurance was on the building, not on the books. The building actually made it through the fire relatively unscathed. The damage was to the books, and it was $22 million worth of books. Not only were the books that were damaged a huge loss, but you also had 700,000 wet, dirty books. If a book is wet, you have 48 hours in which you can save it and dry it. The only option you have, if you can't do it in 48 hours, is to freeze the book and keep it frozen until you have a chance to try to dry it. And that's because mold forms on a wet book, and once they mold, they're gone. So the fire occurs, everybody's in shock, and somebody says, "Who's got a really big freezer for 700,000 books?" I mean, it was really extraordinary to imagine the city contending with this scale of a disaster. They had to get the books out of the building, the wet books, and first of all, find freezers. And secondly, find people to pack the books in boxes, which they had to get the boxes to get them into a freezer in 48 hours. And it really is an extraordinary tribute to the city of Los Angeles that thousands of volunteers showed up and accomplished this, got those 700,000 books out of the building and packed. And they sent them to food warehouses where the owners had agreed to push the frozen vegetables aside and make space for the books. I'm sure they didn't tell them how long they would have them. They had them for about 6 years. And, you know, every now and again I say to people, some of the books still smell like smoke and others smell like broccoli. I mean, this turned into the largest book restoration project ever undertaken. And it is extraordinary that it was largely successful. And the lengths that were taken to save these books was just amazing. But many of the books in the library, if you go there today, are books that survived the fire and were dried out in these hyperbaric chambers and then gone over by a team of librarians and book restoration experts and rebound and recovered and put back into the library. It's pretty amazing. So finally I understood why we were standing in the fiction department smelling books. I was trying essentially to write 4 different books. As I said, the story of the investigation, the story of the day-to-day life of the library, the history and the life of the LA Library, which is an amazing history. Now, I don't know whether all libraries have insane histories or whether you have a Venn diagram of eccentric people who come to LA and eccentric people who work at libraries and they collided. But I have to say that the number of unusual people who have run the Los Angeles Library is, I would say, larger than ordinary. I got so carried away writing the story of these various head librarians. It was almost irresistible. My personal favorite was the story of Charles Lummis, who was hired. Actually, he had been living in Ohio and was a newspaper man, and this was the turn of the century, and was hired by the LA Times, which was a tiny newspaper. And he was living in Cincinnati, accepted this job in LA, and then decided to walk here, as one does. And he was hired to run the library, and he had no training as a librarian. And it was, he ended up getting his job at some great cost, which, again, I'll leave it to you to read the book, but it was not his finest hour. But he ended up as the head of the library. And he was not trained as a librarian, but he was passionate about the library and about getting people to read. And he couldn't stand people reading books that he thought were stupid. So he had a branding iron made with a skull and crossbones, and he would take books that he found particularly egregious, and he would brand them with the skull and crossbones, and then put a slip of paper in saying, "There are far better books on the subject." Something that the library may want to adopt again. And I mean, this, you know, I began this book really having no idea what I would discover, and it just kept growing and growing, and it was absolutely a delight, even though it took me a very long time. The way that I work is I do all of my research first. And until I get to a point where I feel that I've really learned the subject and there's nothing more for me to learn, I don't begin writing. So I had been researching for about 3 years, and I finally thought, all right, I know this subject, I really understand it, I'm ready to write. And one day I was in the library, and I said to the rare book librarian, I said, you know, you're not going to see me around that much anymore because I'm now just going to be at home writing, and I know everything about the library. And she said, oh, and then she stopped for a minute and she said, did you by chance see those boxes in the back corner in the rare book room? And, you know, this is a terrible moment for a journalist because, you know, I was feeling really good about myself, and I thought, you know, I nailed this, I know this, and I'm done, and there's no more reporting to do. And then she says something about some boxes, and I said, no, I didn't see those boxes. And she said, well, wait a minute. And I said, oh, that's okay. And she said, no, seriously, wait a minute. And I stood there kind of like, okay. And she heads off, and I thought I could just run. A few minutes later, she reemerged, and I noticed with great concern that there's a clerk behind her who looks incredibly downtrodden, pushing a cart that is sort of sagging under the weight of the boxes. And the librarian says to me, "I knew it." And she's just smiling and she's so happy. And she says, "There's 78 boxes of material about the library in that back corner. I knew it." And I said, "Oh, that's great. Thanks. That's fantastic." So 2 years later, when I finished, those boxes actually turned out to be extraordinary. They were all of the material that librarians had been collecting about the library really since its inception. Odds and ends, logbooks, notes, meeting information, the instructions on what to do with various wet books and so on and so forth. It was really a treasure trove. One thing that I loved that I just want to read to you briefly is the librarians who answer the phone calls that come into the library. And these come in, even to this day, people will call and say, you know, who won the World Series in 1947? And, you know, the librarians will even say to each other, like, why don't they Google it? Like, why are they calling us? But they kept logs of all these questions, and they were amazing. I could have just published the logbooks of the questions because they were so, it's just so fascinating to think, why was someone thinking that thing at that moment? Like, what triggered that? And they're just crazy, odd, random questions. So I just want to read a few to you that were called in the 1960s, and they came out of these logbooks, which I couldn't get enough of. So, and the reference librarians then were called the Southern California Answering Network, and they were very, very busy because starting in the middle of the day, they would get extremely busy, and they finally figured out that when the libraries on the East Coast closed, everybody would be calling the LA library to answer their stupid questions. So, these are questions that were called in the 1960s. Patron call. Wanted to know how to say the necktie is in the bathtub in Swedish. He was writing a script. Patron called asking for a book on liver disorders for her husband, who is a heavy drinker. Patron wants to know origin of the expression bear coughed at the North Pole, unable to provide answer. Patron call asking whether it is necessary to rise if national anthem is played on radio or television. Explain that one need only do what is natural and unforced. For instance, one does not rise while bathing, eating, or playing cards. Patron call inquiring whether Perry Mason's secretary Della Street is named after a street, and or whether there is a real street named Della Street. Yeah. And this one, which I've already warned my son, I better never catch him calling with this question. Patron asked for help writing inscription for father's tombstone. I guess you can get anything you need at a library. One of the most important things for me in this course of this project was exploring the idea that there are places that are meaningful to us. There are places that are magical. And I really believe that libraries are among those. And as much as I wanted to understand the story of the fire, the story of the history of the library, the story of the day-to-day, I also loved leaving the project feeling that there was a quality that I could never put into words that make libraries as special to us as they are. And how wonderful that that's the case. So I just want to read one more section to you from the book, and then I'm going to be opening it up for questions. And this is from the end of the book. I went to the library late one day, just before closing time, when the light outside was already dusky and the place was sleepy and slow. The library is so big that when the crowds thin out, it can feel very private, almost like a secret place, and the space is so enveloping that you have no sense of the world outside. I went down to the history department, and then I roamed from department to department, just strolling through, and crossed the beautiful hollow rotunda, a gorgeous surprise every time I entered it, and then went up the wide lap of the back staircase, where the statue of civilization stared at me as I made my way. The silence was more soothing than solemn. A library is a good place to soften solitude, a place where you feel part of a conversation that has gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years, even when you're all alone. The library is a whispering post. You don't need to take a book off a shelf to know there is a voice inside that is waiting to speak to you. And behind that was someone who truly believed that if he or she spoke, someone would listen. It was that affirmation that always amazed me. Even the oddest, most particular book was written with that kind of courage, the writer's belief that someone would find his or her book important to read. I was struck by how precious and foolish and brave that belief is, and how necessary, and how full of hope it is to collect these books and preserve them. It declares that all these stories matter, and so does every effort to create something that connects us to one another, and to our past, and to what is still to come. I realized that this entire time I had been convincing myself that my hope to tell a long-lasting story, to create something that endured, to be alive somehow as long as someone would read my books, was what drove me on, story after story. It was my lifeline, my passion, my way to understand who I was. I thought about my mother, who died when I was halfway done with this book, and I knew how pleased she would have been to see me in the library. And I was able to use that thought to transport myself for a split second to a time when I was young, and she was in the moment, alert and tender, with years ahead of her. And she was beaming at me as I toddled to the checkout counter with an armload of books. I knew that if we had come here together, to this enchanted place with all the stories in the world for us to have, she would have reminded me just about now that if she could have been any profession in the world, she would have been a librarian. I looked around the room at the few people scattered here and there. Some were leaning into books, and a few were just resting, having a private moment in a public place, and I felt buoyed by being here. This is why I wanted to write this book, to tell about a place I love that doesn't belong to me, but feels like it is mine, and how that feels marvelous and exceptional. All the things that are wrong in the world seem conquered by a library's simple, unspoken promise. Here I am, please tell me your story. Here's my story, please listen. Thank you. Thank you.
So we have a little time for a few questions, and we're going to ask you to use the mic. We're going to ask you to repeat the question.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So just sing out. Yeah. Yes, ma'am?
In all the years that it took you to write this, how many times would you say you were in the library?
The question is, how many times was I in the library over the course of working on the book? Well, I was going down just about every day for a lot of time. The book took me 6 years. It was about 4 years of research and 2 of writing, roughly. And there would be days where I was home just researching arson or talking to firefighters, or, I wasn't in the library every day, but I was going down there often enough that my parking costs were astronomical. Yes?
How did you write the different sections? Did you write one section about the arson and another section about the history of the library, et cetera?
The question was how I wrote. Basically, did I write all of one story, all of another story, and then kind of weave them, or did I write them as you read them? And I really wrote them as you read them in the book. I would write a section about the arson investigation and come to a point in the arc of the story where I thought, I wanted it to feel as if you were browsing in a library and you would be looking at a book about arson, and then you would stop and put it on the shelf and pull another book out, and that would be the book about Charles Lummis. And then you'd put that back and pull out another book, and it was the story of what goes on in the cataloging department. So I really wrote it like that, and I tried to pace it so that each of the stories had its own momentum, and in particular the investigation, because I wanted the story of the fire to kind of keep you engaged through the entire book. It was tricky. It was a hard book to write. Definitely a hard book to write, and hard to keep track of. I partly worried, whether readers would feel uncomfortable moving around in time, because at one point you're in 1986, and then you're in 1905, and then 1945, and I embraced this idea that it could feel as if you were reading a couple of books at once. Yes, ma'am?
So I noticed in the book that you mentioned that in LA they were starting to make changes in terms of providing counseling services for homeless, and there was a whole new kind of trend. Do you find that that's happening all throughout libraries, or is this individual to our area?
That's a good question. The question is whether providing services, particularly for dealing with people experiencing homelessness, is unique to LA, or whether this is happening around the country. It's happening around the country, and some places provide, there are libraries, I think it's Louisville, or it was on one of my book tour stops, where they have a full-time social worker on staff now in the library. And there isn't a library in this country, by the way, that isn't coping with the issue of homelessness. And rather than turning away from it, they're really trying to, in a proactive way, make the most of what they can do to be of service. So LA has been very progressive and made programming and approaches to helping the homeless people who come to the library, but that it's absolutely happening all over the country, all over the world, I should say. But definitely in this country, that it's on everyone's mind, and different libraries have been much more assertive about what they're doing with programming. Yes?
I thoroughly enjoyed your book and weaving around it. But going back to the arson theory, did you have any backlash from the fire department and the electrical equipment that was so poorly up to date in the library? It was in such disarray as far as safety. Did you find when you researched that the
Well, the question is, the big question that I raised in the book, which was the library was in very bad condition and had all sorts of fire code violations, and there remains the question of whether it was an arson or not. And you were wondering if the fire department, how they responded to the book, or well, I haven't heard from, I actually have heard from one of the fire investigators about the book, and I haven't heard from a lot of them, but and I didn't mean to disparage their investigation. The fact is that arson investigation has, between 1986 and now, has changed enormously. And a lot of the techniques that were used in 86 have either been updated or debunked. And so when you look back on a fire that happened in 1986 in a building filled with paper that had all sorts of fire code violations, I think you have to acknowledge that there's a possibility that it was an accident, or that it started accidentally and that it was not human intervention. Unfortunately, it's impossible to reinvestigate. And arson is the most difficult crime probably to investigate. Usually all evidence is burned up. It's incredibly easy to start a huge fire with something as simple as a match. And it's the least successfully prosecuted felony, and for that reason. So I'm sure there are firefighters, the lead investigators were convinced it was an arson and convinced that Harry had done it, and felt like they really were cheated out of a chance to see him pay for the crime. And so I don't think that they think that it was an accident. Yes?
After hearing you, I opened up my phone to find out the question, who reads the audio version of your book?
Oh.
I have to read it, I'm a reader, but my book groups are going to bring me people delighted to know that there's an oral version and that you are the reader. Could you share a little bit of what is the experience of reading your own words?
Oh, sure. So the question is, what is it like to read your own book for the audio version? And first of all, it's a lot of work. It is a huge amount of work. I was in the studio for about 8 days, and I was getting over bronchitis, so I couldn't read for very long. It's also, the worst thing about it is that you want to edit. And it's terrible, and you're not allowed to. And I kept trying to bargain with the director and saying, can I just one word? I hate that word now. It's awful. And he said, you can't. I mean, it has to be the book, just an audio version of the book. But it was very painful. On the other hand, I'm really glad I did it, and I think readers really prefer it. I'm sure there are writers who are not good readers, and nobody wants to listen to a book that's not well read, but it seems as though readers really prefer it if the writer does the reading. But it really made me appreciate and respect people who are voice actors, because it's not easy. I mean, I always thought, what an awesome job. You can wear your pajamas and you can look like hell and it doesn't matter. And it's exhausting. It's really exhausting, and you kind of need to get it right. So there was a lot of stopping and starting. This is how I spent August, most of August, so. Yes?
What's the subject of your next book?
Oh, well, the question is, what's the subject of my next book? And usually I react to that with great affront and say, well, I don't have a next book yet. But actually, I just got the news today that I am going to start on a next book, and it really is going to be essentially a memoir of my life as a curious person, and writing about the process of writing these books and stories, and kind of telling the backstory, a little bit like what I've done here today. So if you enjoyed this, 6 years from now.
We have time for just one more question.
Yes? Yes.
Okay, I couldn't. I was just curious about the book design. Was that a collaboration between you and the book designer?
Yeah, the question is about the book design, and I think it really is one of the most beautiful books. I all along I felt that a book about books and libraries had to be really special, that it had to look like something distinctly bookish. And I didn't want a dust jacket. I wanted a cloth cover. I wanted just text on the front. I didn't want it to be nostalgic, but I wanted it to be classic. I wanted it to look like a library book. And the art department then just went off and came back with this as the design. And we did, having these decal edges, which is kind of old-fashioned to have the torn edges rather than the cut edges. It really turned out to be even better than I could have ever imagined. And the good news is that we'll keep the same cover for the paperback, and usually they change the cover often because you feel like you can do better. But we're so thrilled with how this looks that we'll do, it'll obviously be different because it's a paper cover instead of hardback, but to me it's almost iconic. It's such a beautiful book. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you for being here. You're welcome. So we're going to just take a minute and kind of let her take a break and set up for signing books. So we have lots of books available if you don't have your own copy yet. Thank you.